What happened when a talk show host pushed Melania Trump too far? The result left the world stunned and reflecting on interviews and personal boundaries. It was a week before the highly anticipated Melania Trump interview, and the buzz was inescapable. The network's PR campaign painted the interview as a must-watch event, drawing in millions of viewers worldwide by calling it a rare, candid conversation with one of the most mysterious first ladies in American history. Immediately after the interview was announced, there was much speculation and public opinion as viewers eagerly awaited what would unfold. Cable news panels analyzed what this interview could mean. Would Melania finally break her silence on her husband, Donald Trump's legal troubles? Would she reveal what life has really been like in the White House, or her reasons for maintaining a low profile during her tenure as First Lady? The host, Julian Carter of The Julian Carter Show, was at the center of it all. He was well known as a sharp and liberal commentator who had built his reputation for grilling his guests and exposing hypocrisy. No one had come on his show without being thoroughly tested and, more often than not, humiliated. Despite the usual blend of humor and political commentary on the show, Julian had often turned the show into an ambush. This was seen last year when his takedown of a conservative senator had gone viral. Now fans and viewers wondered if Melania Trump would be his next ambush victim. This speculation added to the intensity and high expectations for their interview. However, the official narrative was that this would be a fair and balanced discussion focused on her time in the White House and life after Washington. However, in reality, Julian had a different plan. Despite the seeming harmless gesture of the interview, Julian's producers had spent days bringing up the perfect set of questions. Then came the evening of the interview. The air inside the studio was thick with anticipation. The audience had been carefully selected by the show's producers, sitting progressive activists in the front rows, eager to see Melania's stumble. Most people present at the show had come to catch a glimpse of a viral moment, something they could mock and reassure their belief that Melania was out of touch or simply uninformed. However, seated at the back of the audience was a different group, the conservatives. Although their opinions had already been formed about the show, they still wanted to see if Melania would be treated fairly. Social media buzzed with conflicting conversations about the interview. Some called it another political ambush, while others maintained that it was finally time to enter into the world of the First Lady. Meanwhile, backstage, Melania sat unmoved, preparing for her appearance on the show. Although she had done interviews before, she could tell this one would be different. This one wasn't just about her. It was about them. The media, the public, and the people who had spent years monitoring her every move, mocking her accent, questioning her intelligence, and assuming her silence meant ignorance. She knew what Julian wanted. She also knew what to expect from the audience. Melania expected nothing less than unguarded reactions, an admission, a headline, anything to use and discredit her, but she wouldn't give it to Julian. That evening, Julian sat confidently, his polished grin brightened by the studio lights. Tonight's show was supposed to be like any other until it wasn't. Julian decided to shift tactics. Of course, that was typical Julian. He began, his tone carrying a bit of mischief. "We have a very special guest, someone you would never guess would set foot on this stage." The crowd murmured. Curiosity ran through the room. Then, as if well-planned to send the crowd wild, Melania Trump emerged from backstage, dressed in a sleek black suit. Her elegance and posture reflected the features required in a First Lady. The audience was surprised and in awe of her appearance. Some clapped hesitantly, while others exchanged snobbish glances. Melania approached the guest chair with calm confidence. "Thank you for having me," she said, her accent soft but deliberate. The audience's reaction was a mix of curiosity and doubt. The stage was set, but no one, not even Julian, could predict what was about to unfold. He leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other, and offered Melania a polite smile. "There's been so much speculation about your time as First Lady. You didn't do as many interviews as your predecessors. Michelle Obama, for instance, was very open about her struggles. Do you think you could have done more?" Julian asked, leaning forward curiously. Melania tilted her head slightly and sighed, thinking carefully about the question. Every First Lady is different. I was not Michelle Obama. I was myself. Julian's eyes brightened. Some might say you were the most reluctant First Lady in modern history. Melania's expression remained unreadable, meeting his gaze without hesitation. People say many things, she replied. Some viewers in the audience laughed. Julian tried to smile, but his eyes showed mischief. He wasn't here to offer an easy conversation, and everyone in the audience knew it. Still, Melania's calm demeanor seemed to make this difficult for him, at least for a moment. The crowd listened carefully as their conversations continued. Melania spoke about her post-White House work and the difficulties she faced in those roles. Interesting, Julian said after a pause. I would think your most difficult role during your time as First Lady was having to defend your husband? The bait was set, and the tensions rose. Everyone in the room held their breath, imagining how she would respond to the pointed question. Melania, however, remained composed, her hands resting gently on her lap. There were allegations of affairs, lawsuits, and scandals. Did you ever feel trapped? Julian pressed on. I imagine being married to Donald Trump, especially during his presidency, wasn't easy. The media speculated about your marriage constantly. Tabloid reports about you staying in a separate bedroom. Videos where you seemed to pull away from his touch. Were they wrong? Melania looked at Julian and then at the audience. Finally, she turned her gaze directly to the camera. I know who I am. I know my husband. The media has tried for years to tell me what I should think and how I should feel. They don't know me. They don't know my marriage, she said. There was a momentary pause in the room. Julian leaned forward slightly. His expression was unpredictable. The tension had thickened following his initiation of the topic. Julian's smirk widened. He tapped his pen on his armrest, staring at Melania as if carefully planning his next attack. Don't you think there's a reason for that? I mean, no one really knows much about what your marriage to your husband is like other than what is reported in the tabloids, Julian pushed. His tone had shifted, carrying a little benefit as though he was testing the waters before diving deeper. And yet, here we are. Millions watching because you all want to know. Melania responded quickly, her expression unreadable. The audience went silent. Julian's smirk faded just slightly. He had expected an avoidance, maybe even defensiveness. However, Melania had done something unexpected. She had turned the question back on them. The cameras had captured it all. The calm, unreadable expression, the slow and deliberate blink, the quiet confidence. Not a moment was missed. Julian opened his mouth, ready to push further, but he hesitated. The atmosphere in the room had shifted. Melania crossed her hands in her lap. Next question, she said. Julian seemed momentarily surprised by Melania's ability to hold her ground. Still, he quickly regrouped. Speaking of your work, surely you can testify that your husband's actions and words have made it difficult for many Americans to see your work as sincere, Julian said, his voice dripping with arrogance. The air felt heavy as the questions changed course into deeply personal ones. Julian was going too far, but no one cared because it was his nature on the show. Melania tilted her head slightly, trying to maintain her calmness, but there was a flash in her eyes, a look that suggested she was ready for this. The audience sat on the edge of their seats, some whispering amongst themselves. This was the moment they had been waiting for. Julian's smirk grew, sensing he was about to corner his guest. Melania, however, didn't take the bait. Instead, she straightened her posture and replied in a measured, steady tone. It is interesting, Julian, she said, how you ask this question as if I did nothing as First Lady. But let us look at history. She folded her hands in her lap. Julian opened his mouth to interrupt, but Melania didn't allow him. Her voice gained momentum, cutting through the air with sharpness. Eleanor Roosevelt was praised for shaping policy. Hillary Clinton was applauded for influencing healthcare reform. Michelle Obama was celebrated for fighting childhood obesity. But when I advocated for children, I was mocked for my accent. When I focused on cyberbullying, I was told to control my husband. When I spoke about excessive love for painkillers, the media called me a hypocrite. Why do you think that is? The crowd fell silent, trying to process her words. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded. It seemed she beat their expectations. Even Julian seemed at a loss for words on how to respond at the moment. He was shocked by the directness of her response. His smirk disappeared, replaced by a genuine surprise. This was not what he expected. It was clear now. Still surprised by her response, Julian tried to recover, his voice still shaking. Well, Melania, some would argue that your initiatives, such as Be Best, lacked substance. Melania interrupted him with a small, knowing smile. Yet, she said, Michelle Obama also spoke about children's health. She was praised. I was ridiculed. I wore a jacket once, and that became bigger news than any policy I worked on. Why is that? The room became uneasy, all eyes shifting between Melania and Julian. Some liberals who had previously dismissed Melania as passive and uninformed found themselves reconsidering. Even conservatives who had doubted her influence were nodding. She had a point. An older couple in the audience thought within themselves and argued about her response. The husband, a retired school principal, had never been a fan of Donald Trump, but he had also never understood the hostility toward Melania. She's right, he muttered, shaking his head. The media was mean to her. His wife, a lifelong Democrat, frowned. I don't know. I still don't like her association with him. However, that's the point, the husband countered. You don't have to like him. Just look at how different her treatment was compared to the others. She didn't respond, but she didn't argue either. Back on stage, Julian was confused, looking for ways to regain control of the conversation. This was not how it was supposed to go. He had counted on Melania being defensive and shaking under pressure. The script had been clear. She wasn't supposed to win favor with the crowd. She was supposed to struggle, to dodge and crumble under the weight of his questions. Instead, she was changing the narrative on herself, forcing the audience to question their own biases. You're playing the victim, Julian said, his tone deliberately measured. You and your husband always do this. Blame the media instead of owning up to your failures. Melania blinked slowly. She studied him as if trying to figure out the reasons behind his motive. Was this personal? Was there something he stood to profit by doing this? Julian added. Melania searched Julian's eyes, looking for anything that could offer an insight into his motives, and then realized there was none. She heaved a deep breath, focusing on his question. Despite his ambitions, Julian's statement had left an impact. She had to assess herself and figure out if there was truth to what he was saying. Then, she raised her gaze, meeting Julian's smirk right there in the corners of his lips. He was sure he had cornered her. Finally, he could regain control of this conversation. Was he right? Well, it didn't seem so. What Melania said next was something he didn't anticipate. And you? She asked, her brows slightly raised. Who do you blame when you lose? The studio went silent, as all eyes shifted to Julian, eager for his response. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The situation had gone from being a political confrontation to the most uncomfortable conversation in television history. However, Julian wasn't done yet, and his next move increased the tension. He leaned forward, holding an intimate look as if trying to confuse Melania, daring her to falter. Melania, let's shift gears for a moment, he said. His tone was casual, but his were eyes sharp, and then delivered the question no one thought he would dare to ask. You know, Melania, most people have often wondered how you reconcile your drive toward your passion projects with having a strongly patriarchal husband. I mean, there are even reports that you live separately. Can you tell us what's really going on? It was the kind of question that aimed to make someone defensive. The question was so pushy that even the camera crew was surprised. The question was not just bold, it was deeply personal. The audience buckled up, expecting an avoidance or an outburst. However, Melania remained composed. Her expression was calm yet firm. For a moment, she did not respond. The silence stretched just long enough to make everyone uncomfortable. Is that what you believe is most important for the American people? She asked, narrowing her eyes slightly. Julian blinked, adjusting uncomfortably in his seat. You do not ask about border security. You do not ask about the economy. You do not ask about crime in our cities, Melania said with a steady voice. But you ask about gossip, she added. A murmur spread through the crowd. Some nodded in approval of her direction in the interview. Others remained frozen, watching the host struggle to keep up. Then, Melania delivered the line that dominated social media within the hour. Her voice was calm but piercing. It seems that for some, women's empowerment only applies when the woman has the correct political husband. We live in a world where it is easy to criticize someone from the sidelines, she said. Her tone was firm. But the truth is, you cannot understand someone's life unless you have lived it. And I do not owe anyone an explanation on the dynamics of my marriage with my husband. The audience clapped, some even cheering and reacting with shock and admiration. Julian's facial expression changed. His confident smirk was gone, replaced by a look of panic. Among the audience was a young journalist named Sophie. She had written cruel articles about Melania Trump in the past, mocking her for her accent, silence, and unwillingness to challenge her husband. However, now, Sophie found herself shifting uncomfortably. She's actually making sense, one of Sophie's friends admitted. Sophie sighed. Yeah, I still don't like her, but she's not wrong about the double standard. Julian leaned back in his seat, visibly humbled. His earlier confidence was nowhere to be seen. However, what happened after the camera stopped rolling was even more shocking. As the show cut to a commercial break, the audience began to murmur. Melania had not only held her own against Julian's relentless questioning, but had also turned the tables entirely. Assuming the microphones were off, Julian turned to his producer with a frustrated sigh. Jesus, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. I didn't think she would actually have anything intelligent to say. The control room froze. The sound technician's eyes widened. The audio was still live. The audience heard it. The viewers at home heard it. Twitter exploded within seconds. People sighed heavily in the studio. The control room became chaotic, and the producers were confused and desperate to regain control. Go to commercial, now. Meanwhile, a senior editor at a major media outlet had been watching the interview closely. He had already drafted the headline for tomorrow's paper, Melania fumbles in tough interview with Delaney. Now, his mind had changed. Scrap it, he told his junior reporter. The story isn't what she said, it's what Julian just did. Everyone noticed the irony. Julian questioned Melania Trump's intelligence for an hour, only to show his own bias. However, Melania remained composed despite everything falling into chaos. She didn't react. She waited, her hands folded in her lap, as Julian's face turned pale. When the cameras returned, the host's confident demeanor was gone. He knew what had happened, and so did the audience. The atmosphere in the room was completely different now. What began as a calculated and confident means to bring down Melania Trump had become a hot moment, caught on live television. Julian sat awkwardly in his chair. His face showed the grand mistake he had just made. He had lost control and made a comment that would affect the network's audience and ratings and possibly cost him his job. There was no way out for him now. He had always been the one flipping the script and taking down high-profile figures. But today, something more terrible had happened. For all he knew, he had seemingly destroyed his television reputation and social standing with his own words. Melania, on the other hand, remained calm. Her expression hadn't changed, her posture remained graceful, and not a single sign of irritation crossed her face. If she was annoyed, she didn't show it. Meanwhile, before the network could react and control the damage, someone had already taken a clip of the hot mic moment and posted it online. It didn't take long for the public to weigh in their reactions and hot takes on the incident. "We need a statement," a senior executive said. Immediately. One of the younger assistants swallowed hard, holding up her phone. It's really bad, sir." "How bad?" he asked. She turned her phone screen around, and the top headline read, "Liberal host caught on hot mic." I didn't think she would actually have anything intelligent to say. Back on stage, Julian sat firmly holding his chair, unsure what to say next. However, one thing was evident. This interview was over. Despite the hot buzz on the internet, Melania did something no one had anticipated, setting the stage for what became one of the most talked about moments on live TV. She leaned over to Julian. "I'll admit, I didn't think you thought so lowly of me." Julian shifted his gaze. He was ashamed of his words. He had gotten caught up in the moment and was desperate to regain control of the interview. When that didn't happen, he lashed out, instantly regretting his words. He now knew he had gone too far. This was not just the wife of a former president. This was a woman, a person of her own with independent thoughts. He had recognized that now. The once commanding host now seemed almost apologetic. He knew nothing he said would erase the moment, but at least he could apologize to the person he had hurt. "Clearly, I misspoke. I deeply regret my comments." Still, no one believed him. No one except Melania. What she did next left most viewers completely stunned. She leaned forward and began, "I came here today, hoping to speak more on my projects and hopefully change America's perception of me. I'm not sure if that happened." She paused. "However, I'm sure of one thing. I may not have changed the nation's perception of me, but I changed yours. And I think that is just enough for today." Julian's eyes widened in confusion. "What are you saying?" he asked. "I'm saying I'm glad that at least one person now sees me for who I truly am, even if that person is you," Melania said with a half smile. She stood up and walked off the stage. As she exited the building, a crowd of reporters and photographers gathered outside waiting. Questions flew from all directions. "Melania, were you offended by Julian's comments? Do you think he went too far? Were you prepared for this interview? Do you have anything else to say?" However, she didn't stop or even turn to look. She had said everything she needed to say in the interview, and without another word she stepped into her car, leaving the crowd with their questions unanswered. The interview became the most watched clip of the year. The results of this interview were so confusing that even critics had to admit that she didn't just survive the interview, she owned it. With that interview, Melania did something that hadn't been seen on live television before. She turned the media's game against them and won. Although some people called her unshakable and commended the graceful way she handled the interview, others claimed that she was just like any other Trump and had once again dodged accountability. However, regardless of controversial public opinions, everyone could agree that Melania had captivated the nation. Her interview with Julian Carter raised conversations and questions about the boundaries of professionalism and personal respect in interviews. What do you think? Was the host's approach fair journalism, or did it cross the line into media bias? Do you think hosts should be candid with their questions on live interviews, or is there a point at which they should draw a line? How do you feel about bias in certain interview conversations? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If this video was informative, like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Before you go, watch the other videos on your screen.